That cold morning, no one expected an act of compassion to change everything. What started as another quiet day near the reserve became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, every roar and every breath matters, because behind every white tiger there is a story worth saving. The frost clung to the pines like a fragile memory, turning the forest edge into a world of silver and shadow. It was the kind of dawn that bit at your skin, where breath hung in the air like unspoken regrets. Elias Thorne had seen 1,000 such mornings from his cabin porch, nursing black coffee in a chipped mug, watching the mist rise off the river that bordered the Wyoming Reserve. He was a man of routines, carved out by years of solitude after the accident that took his wife and left him with nothing but echoes. At 48, Elias worked odd jobs for the Park Service, fixing fences, clearing trails, tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind at a distance from the ache. That morning the air carried something different, a faint, labored rasp cut through the stillness. Not the wind or a distant engine, but something alive and desperate. Elias paused, mug halfway to his lips, his eyes narrowing toward the tree line. The reserve was home to black bears and elk, wolves that howled at night. But this sound was deeper, a rumble laced with pain. He set the mug down, boots crunching on the icy gravel as he stepped off the porch. The cold seeped through his flannel shirt, but he pressed on, drawn by instinct, the way a man might toward a flickering light in the dark. Deeper into the woods, where the path narrowed to a deer trail, the sound grew clearer, a low, stuttering breath, like wind through broken reeds. Elias's heart quickened, not from fear, but from a pull he couldn't name. He pushed aside low branches heavy with rime, and there, in a small clearing dusted with snow, she lay, the white tigress. Her coat, that rare shimmer of ivory and black stripes, blended with the frost, making her seem almost a ghost of the wild. She was massive, even in repose, her flanks rising and falling in shallow, uneven waves, but it was her eyes that stopped him, golden, wide with exhaustion, fixed on him as if she'd been waiting. She didn't roar or lunge. Instead, her head lifted slightly, a weak nudge toward him, her paw extending just enough to scrape the frozen earth. Blood flecked the snow near her hindquarters, not a gush, but a quiet seep, staining the white ground in dark petals. Labor. She was in labor, alone, far from any pride or sanctuary. White tigers weren't native here. This one must have escaped years ago from some private zoo gone wrong, surviving on the fringes, a legend whispered among rangers. Elias had heard the stories, sightings of a pale shadow in the moonlight, but he dismissed them as tall tales. Now here she was, her body trembling, each breath a silent plea. He froze, the weight of it settling like the cold in his bones. Call the authorities? The reserve rangers would come with tranks and protocols, but by then... He glanced at her eyes again, pleading, not predatory. No one expected this. No one expected him to kneel in the snow, inches from fangs that could end him in a heartbeat. But Elias did. His hand hovered, then touched her flank. Warm, feverish under the fur. She didn't flinch. Instead, a low rumble escaped her throat, not a growl, but something softer, like gratitude. Back at the cabin, Elias's radio crackled to life as he dialed the ranger station. "This is Thorne. You need to get out here now." His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he wrapped a spare blanket around his shoulders, grabbing his truck keys. The line went quiet for a beat before Ranger Lila Voss responded, her tone sharp with disbelief. "A tiger. Elias, you sure it's not a wolf? White tigers don't just wander into Wyoming." "It's her," he said simply, the words tasting like truth. Lila was the station's lead, a no-nonsense woman in her 30s with scars from too many close calls. She'd seen poachers and fires, but this... She hesitated, then barked orders to her team. "Stay put, we're 10 minutes out." But Elias knew 10 minutes might be too long. The tigress's breaths were coming faster now, ragged, her body arching in silent agony. He couldn't leave her. As he returned to the clearing, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The pines whispered overhead, dustings of snow falling like hesitant tears. Elias knelt again, closer this time, murmuring words he hadn't spoken since his wife's funeral. "Hang on, help's coming." Her eyes met his, unblinking, a connection forged in that frozen moment, predator and man, bound by something raw and unspoken. He thought of his own losses, the way grief had hollowed him out, leaving him adrift on these empty highways of life. This tigress, majestic and vulnerable, mirrored that ache. Misunderstood, surviving against odds stacked like winter's endless nights. Lila arrived first, her truck skidding to a halt at the trailhead, followed by Dr. Harlan Reed, the local vet who moonlighted for wildlife calls. Harlan was older, grizzled, with hands that had mended more broken creatures than he cared to count. He carried a medical kit, his face paling as he spotted the tigress through the trees. "Jesus, Elias, that's no stray. She's in distress. Bad." Lila hung back, rifle slung over her shoulder, not aimed, but ready. "We can't just touch her. Protocol says contain first." But Elias was already there, his coat draped over the tigress's shivering form. "She's not attacking. Look at her." The tigress's paw twitched again, as if reaching, her golden eyes locking onto Elias with a desperation that silenced the group. Harlan knelt cautiously, gloved hands probing gently. "Contractions. She's trying to birth, but something's wrong. Maybe the cub's positioned bad. We need to move her, but sedating now. It could kill her." The air thickened with tension, the moral weight pressing down. Lila shifted, her stance rigid. "This thing's a killer, escaped or not. One wrong move and we're done." Her words hung, judgmental, born of fear for the reserve, the town, the rules that kept chaos at bay. But Elias saw beyond that. The tigress wasn't a monster. She was a mother, fighting for life in a world that had abandoned her. Her breath hitched, a weak chuff escaping, and in that sound, Elias felt the pull of redemption, a chance to be more than the man haunted by what he couldn't save. Harlan nodded slowly, his own eyes misting. "If we don't help, no one will." The decision hung there, fragile as the frost. Engines idled in the distance, the cold morning stretching into something profound, a crossroads where compassion clashed with caution, and a white tigress's silent plea demanded they choose. The frost deepened as the morning dragged on, the sun a pale disk struggling through the overcast sky, casting long shadows across the reserve's edge. The Wyoming wilderness stretched out like a forgotten map, pine-choked ridges giving way to the flat sprawl of sagebrush plains, where empty highways cut through like veins of asphalt, leading to nowhere towns that clung to the land out of stubborn habit. Elias's cabin sat on the fringe, a weathered outpost between civilization and the wild, its tin roof rattling faintly in the wind that carried the scent of pine resin and distant rain. The reserve itself was a patchwork of protected acres, patrolled by rangers like Lila, who enforced boundaries not just for the animals, but for the fragile balance of human lives teetering on the margins. Lila Voss paced the clearing's edge, her boots leaving shallow prints in the snow, her breath visible in sharp bursts. She'd grown up in these parts, daughter of a logger who'd lost an arm to a falling tree, and her moral compass was etched with caution. Save the land, yes, but don't invite the wild into your lap. "This isn't a petting zoo, Harlan," she muttered, her voice low, eyes flicking between the tigress and the tree line. "One swipe, and we're explaining to the feds why we let a circus freak roam free. She's not ours to fix." Her words weren't cruel, just pragmatic, born from years of cleaning up after poachers who saw profit in pelts and tourists who fed bears from car windows. To Lila, the tigress represented chaos, a breach in the order she fought to maintain. Dr. Harlan Reed crouched beside the animal, his knees protesting the cold ground, gloved fingers hovering over her swollen flank without touching. He was the town's quiet anchor, a widower who'd buried his own child young, turning his grief into a lifetime of stitching wounds in dimly lit clinics. His stance was one of reluctant mercy. He believed in second chances for the broken, but not at the cost of recklessness. "She's no freak, Lila. Look at her. Those eyes aren't hunting. They're asking." He glanced at Elias, who remained knelt by the tigress, his hand still resting lightly on her fur, feeling the erratic rise and fall of her chest. Harlan's voice softened, a tremor in it, but moving her. "It's a gamble. Her body's shutting down, the cub's stuck. We sedate wrong, we lose them both." The tigress lay still now, her massive form a study in quiet endurance, the white of her coat absorbing the weak light like a canvas of faded glory. Her golden eyes, half-lidded, tracked their movements with a weary intelligence, not the feral glare of threat, but the patient watch of one who knew isolation too well. A faint chuff escaped her, barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves, her paw flexing once more against the earth as if testing the air for allies. She was no native phantom. Whispers in the reserve spoke of her origins, a smuggled cub from a bankrupt roadside attraction down south, released or escaped into the wild a decade ago. She'd evaded capture, a ghost in the underbrush, her rarity a curse that painted her as prize or peril. Now, in labor's grip, her strength ebbed, each contraction a silent ripple under her skin, her breath shallow, labored, carrying the metallic tang of effort. Elias felt the weight of their judgments settle around him, like the gathering clouds. The forest amplified the silence, broken only by the distant hum of Lila's truck engine cooling, the crackle of branches under shifting snow. He thought of the town beyond the reserve, Jackson Hole's outskirts, where locals gathered at the diner swapping stories of elk hunts and winter storms, dismissing wildlife tales as exaggeration. To them, a white tiger would be a monster from old newsreels, unworthy of the risk, a danger to livestock and the illusion of safety. "She's just trying to live," Elias said finally, his voice rough from disuse, breaking the hush. No one responded at first. Lila crossed her arms, staring at the blood-flecked snow, her face a mask of conflict. Harlan busied himself unpacking his kit, pulling out syringes and monitors, his hands steady, but his eyes betraying the old ache of choices that haunted. The tigress's head turned slightly toward Elias, her gaze locking with his in a moment that stretched, heavy with unspoken understanding. In her eyes he saw not accusation, but a mirror. His own losses reflected back, the way grief had stripped him bare, leaving him wandering these empty trails like a shadow. He'd failed his wife in that crash, too far away to reach, and the guilt had built walls around him thicker than the cabin's logs. Now, this creature, majestic in her vulnerability, stirred something dormant, a flicker of purpose amid the numbness. He shifted closer, ignoring Lila's sharp intake of breath, and placed his palm flat against her side, feeling the faint thrum of life within. "Easy," he whispered, the word more for himself than her. She didn't pull away. Instead, her body relaxed fractionally, a low rumble vibrating through her chest, instinctual, almost trusting. Lila stepped forward then, her rifle still slung, but her posture softening just a hair. "Damn it, Elias! You're making this personal." She knelt at a distance, peering at the tigress's hindquarters, her voice laced with the judgment of one who'd seen good intentions turn to tragedy. "Town folk hear about this. They'll want her put down. Exotic pest, they'll call her, not worth the headlines." Harlan nodded grimly, injecting a mild sedative into the air with a test syringe, watching the tigress's reaction. a mere twitch of an ear. "They're scared of what they don't understand," he replied, his tone measured, revealing his own quiet defiance against the world's harsh edges. "But she's no pest. She's a survivor like us." The moral suspense thickened, the clearing a stage for their divided souls. Elias's hand trembled now, not from cold, but from the dawning realization that this act, kneeling here, defying protocol, might be the thread pulling him from his isolation. The tigress's breath hitched again, sharper, her eyes pleading in the gathering silence, forcing them all to confront the line between fear and mercy. Lila radioed the station for backup. Her words clipped, while Harlan prepared for the impossible, a field intervention, hands steadying against the unknown. Engines revved faintly in the distance as more help approached, but in that suspended moment, the world narrowed to the tigress's struggling form, her white fur dusted with snow like tears unshed, and the humans who had to choose if compassion could bridge the wild divide. Dust stirred on the highway beyond, a reminder of the vast, indifferent land. But here, in the heart of the frost, a bond began to form, fragile, fierce, born from the raw edge of survival. The wind picked up as the backup team arrived, their trucks rumbling to a halt at the trailhead like reluctant intruders in the forest's hush. The clearing, once a private arena of desperation, now felt exposed, the tigress's labored breaths the only anchor in the swelling chaos. Elias remained by her side, his knees numb against the frozen ground, the warmth of her flanks seeping through his gloves like a fragile lifeline. The air carried the sharp scent of pine sap, mingling with the earthy musk of her fur, wet from the melting frost that clung to her like a shroud. Her golden eyes, dimming with each passing minute, flickered toward the newcomers, rangers in heavy coats, their faces etched with the wariness of men who'd tangled with the wild before. Lila directed them with clipped efficiency, her voice a low command cutting through the murmurs. Perimeter first, no one gets close without clearance. She was the gatekeeper here, her moral stance unyielding. Protect the reserve, contain the threat. To her, the tigress was an anomaly, a ripple that could drown the careful order she'd built. One of the rangers, a young kid named Torres with wide eyes and a fresh badge, hung back, whispering to his partner about that thing, as if she were a storm cloud gathering force. Their fear was palpable, a collective judgment that painted her white coat not as majesty, but as menace, a escaped exotic that didn't belong, unworthy of the manpower now pulling her into their world. Harlan, undeterred, unpacked his field kit with deliberate slowness, the metallic clink of instruments echoing softly in the silence. His hands, calloused from years of mending the broken, trembled faintly as he assessed her again. The tigress's contractions had slowed, erratic now, her body arching in subtle waves of pain that rippled beneath her fur without a sound. No roars, no thrashing, just the quiet endurance of instinct, her massive form heaving with breaths that fogged the air in shallow puffs. She was a symbol of the misunderstood, her rarity turning survival into suspicion. Locals would whisper of her as a curse, a pale devil haunting the edges of their safe lives. Harlan met Elias's gaze, a shared understanding passing between them. No words needed, just the weight of what might be lost if they turned away. Elias felt the pull deepen, a knot in his chest tightening like the frost on the branches overhead. He'd knelt there for what felt like hours, his whispers the only bridge across the divide. "You're not alone," he'd murmured earlier, the words slipping out unbidden, echoing the prayers he'd abandoned after the crash. Now, as the team encircled them, he resisted the urge to shield her, his hand lingering on her side, feeling the faint kick of the cub within, a life clinging, desperate. The forest judged them all in its silence. The crunch of boots on snow, the distant call of a raven, the Tigress's eyes pleading without plea, forcing the humans to confront their own fractures. The emotional turn came unannounced, in the smallest act. Harlan, after a long beat of hesitation, knelt fully beside her, his gloved hand extending not with a syringe, but with an open palm. He placed it gently on her muzzle, inches from those ivory fangs, and she didn't recoil. Instead, her head tilted ever so slightly, a warm breath washing over his fingers, ragged but trusting. "If we don't help her, no one will," Harlan said, his voice barely above a whisper, the words cracking the tension like thin ice. It was his confession, raw and unpolished. Years of saving strays and farm animals, but never something this wild, this profound. In that touch, his moral stance shifted, redemption flickering in his eyes as he recalled the child he'd buried, the helplessness that had scarred him deeper than any claw. Lila watched, her arms uncrossing slowly, the rifle's weight suddenly burdensome on her shoulder. She stepped closer, her breath hitching at the sight, the Tigress's eyes locking onto Harlan's hand, not with hunger, but with a silent acknowledgement, her tail twitching once in feeble response. "This is insane," Lila muttered, but there was no bite in it, just the tremor of someone whose judgments were crumbling. Torres and the others fell quiet, their fearful chatter dying as the Tigress's presence commanded the space, her vulnerability stripping away their defenses. The reserve's edge, with its empty trails winding toward forgotten highways, mirrored their inner divides, cold mornings giving way to the warmth of choice. Rising tension coiled like the river beyond the trees, swift and unforgiving. Harlan prepared for the intervention, his kit splayed open on a sterile cloth, monitors beeping faintly, a portable ultrasound humming to life. "The cub's breech," he confirmed, his voice steadying as he worked, gloved fingers tracing her flank with clinical care. "We can't wait for the chopper, she's fading." The Tigress's breaths grew shallower, her chest laboring in visible heaves, eyes half closing as pain etched lines of exhaustion into her noble face. Elias held her head steady, his own heart pounding in rhythm with hers, the bond solidifying in the shared struggle. No supernatural grace here, just raw, grounded peril. The risk of infection from the cold, the danger of her thrashing in delirium, the moral gamble of intervening without full sedation. Lila radioed for the vet transport, her words urgent now, laced with a newfound resolve. "Clear the road, we're bringing her in." But doubt lingered in the air, thick as the gathering mist. What if she turned? What if the town turned on them, labeling it folly? The Tigress chuffed weakly, her paw scraping the earth once more, as if urging them onward, her instinct a quiet force against their fears. Engines revved in preparation, dust from the highway filtering through the pines like a veil. But in the clearing, time suspended, human hands trembling on fur, breaths mingling in the frost, compassion forging a path through the wild unknown. Harlan administered a measured dose, the needle's prick met with only a faint shudder from the Tigress, her eyes fluttering but holding Elias's gaze. The world narrowed to this, the slow burn of decision, the weight of lives intertwined. As her body relaxed under the sedative's gentle hold, the team moved with careful precision. Blankets draped, a makeshift stretcher formed from branches and tops. Elias lifted her shoulders, muscles straining against her weight, feeling the heat of her core against the chill. Lila took the hindquarters, her hands steadying, the silence between them speaking volumes. They carried her toward the trucks, each step a testament to the bond forming. The Tigress's head lolling against Elias's chest, her breath warm on his neck. The forest watched in judgment. But in that carry, redemption whispered, humans, flawed and fearful, choosing to bridge the divide. The highway loomed ahead, empty and waiting, a road to uncertainty where survival hung by threads of kindness. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and compassion can travel. The truck's engine growled low as it crawled along the rutted trail, the chassis shuddering over roots and frozen ruts that mimicked the Tigress's own labored rhythm. Elias rode in the bed, the wind whipping through his hair like icy fingers, his arms cradling her massive head against his chest. Her white fur, matted now with sweat and snowmelt, pressed warm and heavy against him, her breaths coming in shallow, uneven puffs that fogged the crisp air. The sedative held her in a fragile truce, her golden eyes half open, glassy but aware, flicking toward him in fleeting moments of recognition. No roars shattered the quiet, just the soft chuff of her exhales, each one a thread pulling at the knot in his throat. The highway stretched ahead, a grey ribbon cutting through the sagebrush, empty save for the occasional tumbleweed skittering like lost thoughts. Harlan sat beside him, monitoring her vitals with a handheld device that beeped faintly against the rumble of tires. The vet's face was drawn, lines etched deeper by the cold and the weight of what they'd started. "Pulse is dropping," he murmured, more to himself than the others, his gloved fingers adjusting an IV line taped to her foreleg, saline dripping steadily into her vein. The medical crisis unfolded in increments. The cub still lodged, her body weakening from the effort, contractions fading into tremors that rippled through her flanks like distant thunder. Harlan's hands moved with practiced calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm. This wasn't a barnyard birth. It was a battlefield where instinct clashed with exhaustion, and human intervention teetered on the edge of salvation or doom. Lila drove, her knuckles white on the wheel, the cab's radio crackling with updates from the station. "ETA to the clinic. 5 minutes. Keep her stable back there." Her voice was steady, but the rear-view mirror caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes. The ranger, who'd always drawn lines, now blurring them for a creature she deemed a threat. The team followed in a convoy, Torres's truck trailing close, his earlier whispers silenced by the gravity of the load. The reserve's edge gave way to open plains, the pines thinning to reveal the vast, indifferent sky. Dust devils swirling in the distance like echoes of forgotten storms. This was Wyoming's raw heart, cold mornings bleeding into uncertain afternoons, where engines cooled on shoulders and lives hung in the balance. As they hit the smoother asphalt, the Tigress stirred, a low rumble building in her chest, not aggression, but the raw edge of pain breaking through the haze. Her body tensed, paws flexing against the tarp beneath her, claws scraping wood with a sound like splintering resolve. Elias tightened his hold, whispering into her ear, "Easy, girl. Almost there." Her head lifted fractionally, muzzle brushing his arm, a warm exhalation carrying the faint musky scent of her struggle. In that touch, he felt the depth of her instinct, a mother's fierce will, pleading silently against the void. The bond, forged in the clearing's frost, deepened here amid the motion, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that pierced the numbness he'd carried for years. The clinic loomed at the town's fringe, a low brick building on the outskirts of Jackson Hole, its parking lot empty under the pallid sun. Harlan had called ahead. The local wildlife rehab center was prepped, floodlights humming in the bay like hesitant beacons. They eased her onto a gurney, the team moving in synchronized hush, muscles straining under her weight. Lila directed the unload, her commands sharp, but laced with an undercurrent of care. "Slow, watch the line." Torres hesitated at the doors, his face pale, murmuring to no one. This thing could wake up swinging. His fear echoed the town's unspoken verdict. Exotic dangers didn't belong in their quiet corners, unworthy of the spotlight or the risk. But no one voiced it aloud. The Tigress's presence commanded silence, her weakening breaths a judgment on their hesitations. Inside, the air shifted to sterile warmth, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the concrete floor. Harlan led the way to the surgical suite, a space usually reserved for deer fractures and eagle wings, now transformed for this impossibility. The tigress lay on the table, her form dwarfing the space, white coat stark against the steel, monitors hooked up, beeping in erratic symphony, heart rate spiking, then dipping, oxygen levels teetering. "She's crashing," Harlan said, voice tight as he scrubbed in, mask hiding the tremor in his jaw. The rising tension coiled. The cub's position demanded intervention, a C-section in the field of doubt, no time for full anesthesia that might stop her heart. Harlan's scalpel hovered, gloved hands steadying against the unknown, sweat beading under his brow despite the chill. Elias stood at her head, a makeshift restraint of soft straps around her paws, his palm flat on her forehead. Her eyes met his again, wide now with the haze of drugs and pain, a golden plea that twisted something deep within him. She chuffed softly, her breath hitching, body arching in a contraction that nearly bucked the table. No blood, no violence, just the quiet war of survival. Her flanks heaving, eyes reflecting the light like fractured sunlight on snow. Lila paced the periphery, radio in hand, coordinating with state officials who questioned the protocol, their voices tinny warnings of liability and danger. "This could end careers," she relayed, her own stance fracturing further, the ranger confronting the morality of bending rules for a misunderstood soul. Harlan incised with precision, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and her fur, his breaths measured against the beeps accelerating. "Got it. Hold her steady." The cub emerged, slick and still, a tiny mirror of her mother in ivory and stripes, its chest unmoving. Tension peaked in that suspended breath, the team frozen, Harlan's hands working frantically with suction and rubs, his face a mask of concentration, masking the old grief resurfacing. Elias leaned in, his voice a low murmur to the tigress. "Come on, fight." Her eyes never left his, instinct bridging the species divide, her rumble vibrating through him like shared resolve. The cub stirred then, a weak mule piercing the silence, lungs filling with its first ragged breath. Harlan exhaled, wrapping it in a warmed towel, placing it against her side. The tigress's head turned, nuzzling instinctively, her tongue rasping gently over the tiny form. Relief washed through the room, but the crisis lingered, her own recovery uncertain, stitches closing wounds that spoke of deeper scars. Outside, the highway hummed with passing semis, engines cooling in the distance, a reminder of the world's indifference. Yet here, in the quiet aftermath, compassion had carved a path, hands that trembled now steadied, judgment softened by the sight of mother and cub breathing in tandem. Lila leaned against the wall, arms crossed but eyes soft, the moral suspense yielding to a tentative hope. Elias watched the tigress, her golden gaze holding his in silent gratitude, the weight of the morning's choices settling like dust in the wind. The bond endured, fragile as the cub's first cries, pulling him toward a revelation still unfolding in the shadows of survival. The fluorescent hum in the surgical suite faded into a distant drone as the tigress lay on the table, her massive form rising and falling in the shallow cadence of post-sedation recovery. The cub, no larger than a house cat, nestled against her side, its tiny flanks heaving with the erratic breaths of new life, pink tongue darting out to lap at the warmth of her fur. Elias stood sentinel at her head, his hand resting lightly on her muzzle, feeling the subtle shift of her exhales, warm, ragged, carrying the faint musk of milk and exhaustion. The room smelled of antiseptic and wet earth. The concrete floor, slick with melted snow, tracked in from the trucks outside. Monitors beeped in soft counterpoint, their green lines tracing the fragile thread of her vitals, a heartbeat steadying, but not yet strong. Harlan peeled off his gloves with a snap, his shoulders slumping as he leaned against the counter, wiping sweat from his brow. The vet's eyes, shadowed by the weight of the hours, lingered on the pair, mother and cub, ivory forms entwined in instinctual quiet. "She's stable for now," he said, voice low, breaking the hush like a stone skipped across still water. "But the blood loss. Infection could set in fast out here. We need to keep her warm, monitored." His words hung, laced with the unspoken. This was no ordinary recovery. The tigress's body, honed for wild solitude, rebelled against the sterile confines. Her paws twitching faintly against the restraints as if dreaming of open trails. Lila hovered near the door, her rifle propped against the wall now, forgotten in the shift of priorities. The ranger's face, usually etched with the hard lines of duty, softened in the dim light. Her arms folded tight across her chest as if holding back the tide of what she'd witnessed. "State's on their way," she murmured, glancing at the radio clipped to her belt. "They'll want her crated, shipped to a facility. Sanctuary rules, no exceptions." Her stance revealed the fracture in her resolve, the protector of boundaries now questioning if lines could bend for something this raw. Torres lingered in the hallway, peering through the observation window. His earlier fear muted to wide-eyed awe, but whispers from the station echoed his doubt, the town murmuring of costs, dangers, a white tiger that didn't fit their rugged narrative. Outside, the afternoon light slanted low across the parking lot, casting long shadows from the idling trucks, engines ticking as they cooled against the chill wind sweeping in from the plains. The highway beyond hummed with the occasional rumble of semis, dust clouds rising like ghosts in the rearview mirrors of passing rigs. Elias felt the pull of that vastness, the empty roads that had become his refuge after the accident, the screech of tires on wet pavement, the silence that followed his wife's last breath in a hospital much like this one. He'd driven those nights, aimless, the radio off, just the wind and the weight of failure pressing down. Now, watching the tigress's eyes flutter open, golden slits fixing on the cub with a fierce tenderness, he saw his own ghosts mirrored there. Loss, survival, the quiet beg for one more chance. She stirred then, a low chuff escaping her throat, not pain but recognition, her head lifting to nuzzle the cub closer. The little one mewled softly, rooting against her, and her body responded in instinctual waves, milk scent blooming in the air, her flanks contracting gently. Elias's hand trembled on her fur, the warmth seeping through to chase the cold from his bones. In that moment, the emotional turn deepened. He leaned in, his whisper barely audible over the monitors. "You've got her now. Rest." Her gaze shifted to him, holding steady, as if sensing the fracture in his soul, the man who'd knelt in the snow not just for her, but for the redemption he couldn't name. Harlan noticed, pausing in his notes, a knowing glance passing between them. The vet had lost his daughter to a fever years back. A small body going still under his hands in a room not unlike this. "Some bonds," Harlan said quietly. "They find you when you need them most." But rising tension coiled anew as the tigress's breaths hitched, a subtle wheeze threading through the rhythm, her body shuddering once, twice. Harlan's face tightened, rushing back with the stethoscope. Fever's spiking, the incision, it's holding, but her system's fighting hard. He adjusted the IV, saline mixing with antibiotics, his hands moving with the urgency of a man who'd danced this edge before. The cub whimpered, sensing the shift, its tiny paws kneading against her side. Lila stepped forward, her hand hovering near the table before pulling back, the moral suspense reigniting. Save her at what cost? The state team would arrive soon, protocols demanding separation, relocation, ripping this fragile family apart for the sake of safety nets that often snapped. Elias felt the revelation stirring, a late truth bubbling up from the depths. As he stroked her ear, murmuring old lullabies his wife had sung, a memory surfaced sharp as the frost that morning. The accident report, the details he'd buried. His wife had been pregnant, a secret they'd kept close, lost in the crash along with her. The grief had doubled him over, leaving him hollow, wandering these highways to outrun the what-ifs. Now the tigress's eyes met his again, unblinking, and in their golden depths he saw not just plea but echo, the fierce protection of a mother, the silent justice of enduring loss. Why her? Why now? The realization hit like the wind through the pines. She'd chosen him that morning, tapping at the edge of his world, because in her desperation she'd sensed a kindred spirit, one who knew the ache of unborn promises. The door swung open then, state officials in crisp uniforms filing in, clipboards at the ready, their voices a murmur of assessments and liabilities. "We'll need to sedate for transport," one said, eyes on the tigress with clinical detachment, judging her as anomaly, not ally. Lila intercepted, her voice firming. "Give us time. She's just stabilized." Tension peaked in the room's confines, the air thick with conflicting wills, fear versus faith, rules versus the raw pull of compassion. The tigress chuffed weakly, her paw extending toward Elias, claws sheathed, a gesture of trust that silenced the newcomers for a beat. Harlan worked on, stabilizing her fever with cooling packs, his own redemption weaving through the care, the father saving what he once couldn't. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in bruised purples, the empty highway a promise of journeys unfinished. Elias held her gaze, the bond solidifying amid the beeps and whispers, his heart hitching at the why of it all. She'd begged not just for help, but for the man who needed to save as much as she needed saving. The cub nursed quietly, a small light in the gathering dusk, as the team navigated the crisis, hands trembling on fur and forms, breaths mingling in the sterile hush, compassion carving deeper into the wild heart of survival. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. The state's lead official, a stern woman named Carver with a clipboard, clutched like a shield, paced the surgical suite's perimeter, her polished boots echoing off the concrete in sharp, judgmental taps. The air hung heavy with the scent of iodine, and the tigress's earthy musk now mingled with the faint, sweet undertone of the cub's nursing. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark pools of white on the monitor's glowing screens, where lines danced in fragile patterns, her heartbeat a steady thrum, but her temperature line jagged, spiking erratically like a warning unspoken. The tigress lay on her side, restraints loosened now, her white flanks rising and falling in labored waves, the stitches along her abdomen hidden beneath a light bandage that rose and fell with each breath. Her golden eyes, clearer but weary, tracked the room's movements with quiet vigilance, the cub tucked against her belly, its tiny form a bundle of instinctive warmth, mewling softly in rhythm with her exhales. Elias remained at her head, his chair pulled close, one hand extended palm up on the table's edge, inches from her muzzle. He'd shed his coat hours ago, the room's controlled warmth doing little to thaw the chill that had settled in his core since the morning's frost. His breaths came slow, sinking unconsciously with hers, the bond a silent current pulling him deeper into the vigil. Outside, the Wyoming dusk deepened, the highway's sodium lamps flickering to life like distant stars, engines rumbling past in the gathering night, reminders of lives moving on, indifferent to the quiet war unfolding here. Carver's team hovered. 2 techs in hazmat suits preparing a transport crate in the adjacent bay, their murmurs low and clinical. Exotic species protocol, sedation, containment, relocation to federal facility. To them, she was inventory, a liability in fur and fangs. Unworthy of the emotional tether, Elias felt coiling tighter with every shared glance. Harlan worked at the counter, mixing another dose of antibiotics, his movements precise but shadowed by fatigue, the lines around his eyes deepening like cracks in dry earth. She's fighting the infection. he said quietly, not looking up, his voice threading through the beeps like a confession. The rising tension built in layers. The tigress's body, resilient yet ravaged, now rebelled against the intrusion. A low fever turning to shivers that rippled through her coat, her paw flexing weakly against the table as if testing the boundaries of her cage. The cub sensed it, its nursing pausing, tiny head lifting with a plaintive chuff that echoed the mother's ragged exhale. No dramatic thrashing, just the subtle war of survival, breaths hitching, eyes dimming fractionally, the weight of exhaustion pressing down like the snow-heavy pines back at the reserve. Lila stood by the door, her stance a bridge between worlds, Ranger's duty clashing with the compassion she'd glimpsed in the clearing. She intercepted Carver's advance, her voice low but firm. She's a mother now. Ripping them apart could kill her. Carver's response was clipped, her eyes flicking to the Tigress with detached appraisal. Sentiment doesn't override regulations. This animal's a public risk, escaped, undocumented. We've got reports of livestock kills. She's no saint. The words landed like judgments from the town's collective fear, painting the tigress as monster, her white beauty a lure for trouble rather than a call for mercy. Lila's jaw tightened, her hand drifting to her belt, not for the radio but in futile gesture, the moral suspense thickening as protocols loomed like storm clouds over the horizon. Elias felt it all pressing in, the room's walls closing like the cab of his old truck on those endless night drives after the accident. The revelation stirred deeper now, no longer a flicker, but a flood, the why of her plea that morning crystallizing in the sterile light. As her muzzle nudged his hand, warm and trusting, a memory surged. The hospital room years back, the doctor's hesitant words about his wife's pregnancy, the unborn child lost in the wreckage he'd survived. He'd wandered since, adrift on empty highways, the guilt a constant companion, whispering of failures he couldn't mend. But here in her golden gaze, he saw the parallel, the tigress's desperate reach across the snow, begging not just for life, but for the solace of shared loss. She'd chosen him, her instinct piercing his isolation, recognizing the hollow man who knew the ache of protecting what was slipping away. His breath hitched, tears held back as he stroked her ear, the touch grounding him. "I get it now," he whispered, the words for her alone, reframing the morning's frost-kissed clearing as destiny's quiet tap on his door. The tigress responded with a soft rumble, her head shifting to press against his palm, the cub stirring anew at her side, its warmth a bridge between them. Harlan administered the dose through the IV, watching her vitals steady fractionally. But the tension coiled tighter, Carver's team advancing with the crate, needles prepped for relocation sedation. "Time's up," the official said, her voice slicing the hush. Lila stepped forward, blocking the path, her eyes meeting Elias's in silent alliance. "Give her the night. She's earned that." The air crackled with conflict, human wills clashing against instinct's plea. The tigress's eyes widening slightly, locking on Elias with urgent depth, her body tensing as if sensing the threat to her fragile family. Outside, the wind howled faintly through the vents, carrying the chill of the plains, dust whispering against the windows like unspoken regrets. Engines idled in the lot, cooling in the dark. A symphony of the world's relentless motion. Harlan's hands trembled now as he adjusted the monitor, his own past echoing in the moment. The daughter he'd held as fever claimed her, the helplessness mirroring this fight. The team paused, the crate's shadow looming, but the tigress's chuff cut through, weak yet insistent, her paw extending toward Elias once more. In that gesture, the late revelation bloomed fully for him. Her beg wasn't random, it was a mirror to his soul, pulling him from the shadows of loss into the light of purpose. The moral weight pressed, forcing choices, rules versus redemption, fear versus the silent connection binding man and beast. Carver hesitated, clipboard lowering, the room suspended in the balance. breaths mingling, hands hovering. The cub's mule a fragile anchor. The highway stretched into the night beyond, empty and waiting, as compassion's thread strained against the pull of indifference, the tigress's golden eyes pleading for one more dawn. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. The night's chill seeped through the clinic's walls, a quiet siege against the warmth of the surgical suite, where the tigress lay in the dimmed glow of a single overhead light. Her white coat, cleaned now of the morning's frost and strain, gleamed softly against the padded table, her flanks rising and falling in the steady rhythm of hard-won rest. The cub, its tiny body curled into the curve of her belly, nursed with instinctive pulls, each swallow a faint, wet sound that filled the hush like a whispered promise. Elias sat unmoving in his chair, his hand still extended, fingers brushing the soft fur of her muzzle. Warm now, no longer fevered, the antibiotics weaving their slow magic through her veins. Her golden eyes, half-lidded in repose, flicked open at intervals, meeting his in silent acknowledgement, the bond a thread woven from the frost-kissed clearing to this sterile sanctuary. Harlan lingered at the monitors, his back to the room, adjusting dials with hands that no longer trembled, the lines of exhaustion softening as her vitals held steady. The air carried the faint tang of saline and milk, mingling with the distant hum of the highway outside, engines cooling in the dark, semis rumbling past like ghosts on an endless vigil. Carver and her team had retreated to the hallway after a tense standoff, their clipboards silent for the moment, Lila's quiet insistence buying them the night. "She's not a threat," the ranger had said, her voice low, edged with the conviction born from the day's unraveling judgments. No one argued. The tigress's presence commanded the space, her breaths a gentle tide washing away the fears that had gathered like dust on the plains. Elias felt the revelation settle deep, no longer a storm, but a clear horizon, reframing the morning's plea in the quiet of this vigil. Her paw had extended not in random desperation, but in instinct's unerring sight, sensing the hollow in him, the man adrift since the crash that stole his wife and their unborn child. He'd driven those empty roads afterward, the wind through the open window carrying echoes of what might have been, his hands gripping the wheel to outrun the guilt of survival. Now, watching the cub's flanks heave in tandem with hers, he saw the parallel etched in fur and fate, the fierce guard of a mother, the silent endurance against loss. She'd begged him because he understood in his bones the weight of protecting life against the indifferent wild. His breath hitched, unshed tears blurring the light as her muzzle nudged his palm once more, a chuff escaping, soft as gratitude, her eyes holding his with a depth that bridged their worlds. The door creaked open, Lila slipping in with 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising like mist off the river at dawn. She handed one to Elias without a word, her stance looser now, the rifle left in the truck, a symbol shed in the face of what they'd forged. Harlan accepted his, sinking into a stool, the silence between them thick with the day's unspoken truths. "State's backing off till morning," Lila murmured finally, her eyes on the tigress. "Paperwork, assessments, but for now, she's ours to watch." No triumph in her tone, just the quiet relief of choices made, her moral compass realigned by the sight of mother and cub entwined, the white forms a testament to survival's raw beauty. Outside, the wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of cold earth and distant rain, the parking lot empty save for the truck's shadowed hulks. The highway stretched into the black, a vein of asphalt leading to forgotten towns where stories like this dissolved into whispers, misunderstood tigers dismissed as myths, compassion traded for caution. But here, in the suite's hush, the emotional core pulsed, The tigress's breaths evening out, the cub's mules fading into sleep, Elias's hand steady on her fur. Harlan broke the quiet, his voice a low rumble. "Some things find their way, like she found you." Elias nodded, the words landing soft, awakening the redemption that had eluded him. The act of kneeling in the snow, not just saving her, but pulling him from the shadows, filling the void with purpose born of shared instinct. Dawn crept in slow, painting the windows with pale gold, the frost on the panes melting into rivulets like tears released. The tigress stirred first, her head lifting with newfound strength, golden eyes clear as she nuzzled the cub awake. It tumbled playfully against her, tiny paws batting at her whiskers, eliciting a rumble from her throat, not pain, but the deep contentment of life reaffirmed. Harlan checked her stitches, nodding approval, the infection beaten back by will and care. Carver returned with the light, her clipboard tucked away, the team's suits traded for coats. "We'll arrange sanctuary," she said, voice softened by the scene. "Local oversight, no crates, no rush. She's earned her place." Lila's hand rested briefly on Elias's shoulder, a silent alliance sealed, her judgments dissolved in the tigress's quiet majesty. They moved her to a spacious enclosure at the reserve's edge that afternoon, the truck easing along the highway under a sky clearing to blue. Elias walked beside the open bed, her head on his lap, the cub cradled in a blanket nearby. The wind tugged at their fur, carrying the scent of pine and freedom, engines idling as they reached the gate. Rangers and vets gathered, their earlier fears muted to awe, the town beyond beginning to murmur not of danger, but of wonder. A white tigress, symbol of misunderstood strength, redeemed by hands that chose kindness over fear. In the weeks that followed, Elias visited daily, watching from the fence as she taught the cub to stalk shadows in the underbrush, her strides regaining grace, white coat shimmering under the sun. The bond endured in glances across the divide, her chuff a greeting that echoed his healing heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she paused at the tree line, cub at her heels, golden eyes meeting his one last time, a nod of farewell, instinct calling her deeper into the wild. She turned then, vanishing into the horizon's embrace, a pale silhouette against the golden light, cubs trailing in her wake, mother and offspring walking free, tails flicking like flags of survival. The empty highway stretched behind, dust settling in the wind, a reminder that compassion, born from fear and loss, mends the fractures in us all. In the world of cold mornings and indifferent roads, such acts whisper why kindness endures, to bridge the silent divides, honoring the instinct that binds us, ensuring no plea goes unheard. The reserve's edge fell quiet, pines whispering overhead, the river murmuring its eternal song. Elias stood there long after, breath steady, the ache eased, not gone, but shared. Survival demanded it. Hope made it possible. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching. The case of White Tigress begs man for help. Moments later, he realizes why. See you in the next one.